Today's daf is Yevamos daf Tes Zayin, and we are at the very top line of daf Tes Zayin Amud Aleph, Tashma. Today's daf is being learned as a schus for Shalema for Avadia ben Miriam Leah, Moshe Abba ben Devorah bas Mechel, Shmuel ben Tehila, Elazar Lipa Shalom ben Feger Rachel, Sarah Nechama bas Rus Malka, Baruch ben Rachel, Yisachar ben Hindel Liba, Malka Miriam bas Esther, and Esther Kreindel bas Devorah. Today's daf is also being learned Le'ilu Nishmas Mordechai Moshe ben Zelig and Le'ilu Nishmas Frada Blima Bas Moshe. So we're in the middle of a sugya, which is very much a digression from the sugyas of Masechtas Yevamos, and that is the sugya of Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Specifically, the Gemara mentioned a Machlokes Amayroim, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, Rav and Shmuel, whether Beis Shammai, who clearly saw the world very differently than Beis Hillel, does that mean that they also observed their halachos? Or perhaps, although they intellectually believed that Beis Hillel was wrong in many areas of halacha, but at the same time, they understood that Beis Hillel was the majority of Klal Yisrael, and there's a principle, achrei rabim lahatos, and based on that, ultimately, when it came to Lemaisa, they followed the Shita of Beis Hillel. The Gemara brought a whole bunch of different rayas. Today's daf is going to mention one final Tashma, and this Tashma is going to resolve this dispute. So the Gemara Tashma, he made Rav Doisa ben Hurkinus in the times of Rav Doisa ben Hurkinus, Hutra Tsaras Habas La'achim. They were mater Tsaras Habas, Tsaras Erva to Yibum. Shma Mina Asu, says the Gemara. You see from here that the school of Shammai didn't only think differently than Beis Hillel, but they actually practiced differently than Beis Hillel. And says the Gemara, Shma Mina, this is checkmate. This is an absolute riot. So it's interesting. The sugya began with regards to the Machlokes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel related to Tzaras Erva. We went around the world discussing different rayas and trying to prove the shaila, whether lo yasu k'divrei Beis Hillel or whether asu v'asu. Bottom line is the Gemara returned to where it began, and that is the raya that Beis Shammai actually did kishitasam is from the halacha of Tzaras Erva, and the raya is from a real-life story that happened in the times of a Tana, whose name was Rav Doisa ben Hurkinus, and it was during his times that Hutra Tzaras Abbas La'achim, that's Shitas Beis Shammai, according to Beis Hillel, but Tzaras Erva is an Eishes Ach Shaloi b'Makom Mitzvah, and the Gemara says if that's the case, Shmami, no, Beis Shammai actually followed Beis Shammai. So we just mentioned that in the times of Rav Doisa ben Hurkinus, they were Mater Tzaras Habas La'achim. So the Gemara now is going to elaborate and tell us a story. Goof, Rav Doisa ben Hurkinus, in the times of Rav Doisa ben Hurkinus, they were matter at Tzaras Erva, like Shitas Beit Shammai, not like Shitas Beit Hillel. And this was something that bothered the Chacham very much, because they felt that Rav Doisa ben Hurkinus was a Chacham Gadol. He was a very, very wise person. And his eyes didn't allow him to come to Beis Medrash, meaning his eyesight was waning. And as a result, it was difficult for him to come to Beis Medrash. And they felt that it was for that reason that he was mater tzaras habas lach. Amar. So the Chachamim got together and they said, Mi yelech v'yodim. Someone has to come notify Rav Doisa ben Hurkinus that a tzaras erva is not mutter, but that it's Tzaras Erva is also. And the question was, who should go? I'm going to be Yeshua. Yeshua said, Ani Eilech. I'm going to go. V'achrav me. He can't go himself. Who's going to go along with him? Who's going to escort Rabbi Yeshua? Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, I'm going to go. V'achrav me. And who's going to go along with him? Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva. So the Gemara says, Holchu. They went. Who's they? Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, and Rabbi Akiva. V'amdu Pesach Beis. And they waited for him at his front door. Nichnasa Shivchasai. In the meantime, Rabbi Doisa ben Hurkinus, the Shifcha, this woman that worked in her house, saw them. So she went to her master, to Rabbi Doisa ben Hurkinus, and said, Rabbi Chachmi Yisrael, I recognize the Chachmi Yisrael, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, and Rabbi Akiva, and they've come to see you. So he told her, Yichnesu, tell them they can come. V'nichnesu, they came. So immediately Rabbi Doisa ben Hurkinus saw Rabbi Yeshua. He grabbed him by Shivua Mita Shalzah, and he put him on a Mita Shalzah. He put him on a bed of gold. So he told him, Rebbe, and Moila Talmidcha Achav Yesh. So Rabbi Yeshua tells Rabbi Doisa ben Hurkinus that Rebbe, he says, will Can you please ask your other Talmidim to sit down? I'm like, Mihu. Who are these other Talmidim? Meaning he recognized Rabbi Yeshua, but he didn't recognize Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, and he didn't recognize Rabbi Akiva. So he said, who are these other people? So Rabbi Yeshua mentioned Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah first. He said, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. It's Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Amar, he said, who's this Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah? He's Elazar, the son of Azariah. He said, "V'yesh lo ben la Azariah chavirenu." Azariah, our chaver, has a friend. When he heard that, yes, in fact, he does, and not just he does, but he has a son. That's the great Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. So he said, "Nar hoyisi gamzo kanti." V'loyro yisi tzadik nezam. Nar hoyisi. When I was young, I knew Azariah. The gamzo kanti. Now I'm older. I know Azariah's son, Rabbi Elazar. Oh, but v'loyro yisi tzadik nezam. And I see that the tzaddik was zoicha to have a son that's like him. The zari mevakesh lochem. Additionally, I haven't seen the child of the tzaddik need lechem. The Marsha says that what he meant by the end of the pasuk v'zari mevakesh lochem is because we know the Gemara says in Masechta Shabbos Daf Nun Hey Amud Beis that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was a tremendous oisher. The Gemara talks about the taxes, the ma'aseh behema that he used to give every year, and the numbers were literally b'derech haflaga. He was one of the wealthiest people of his generation, and apparently, says the Marsha, this ashiras that he had was very much, in large part, because of the fact that his father was also a very big Osher. So he said, Naro yisi gamzo kanti v'lo yisi tzadik nezav dezarim mevakesh lochem. I see Azariah has a son, and I see he's coming in with the ganze ashiras. Either way, tough so. So Bais ben Hurkins took Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, and he put him also on a bed that was of gold. Amaloi. So Rabbi Shua continued. He said, Rabbi, there's another Talmud of yours that's here. Can you please ask him to sit down? Amaloi Mihu. Who is he? So Yeshua told him, Akiva ben Yosef. It's Akiva ben Yosef. So Yosef ben Hurkins tells Rabbi Akiva, tell me, Atahu Akiva ben Yosef, you're the famous Rabbi Akiva that I've heard so much about, whose reputation precedes him, and it literally goes from sea to shining sea. So he told him, Shev beni Shev, have a seat. That halavai, there should be more people like you in Klal Yisrael. Either way, it's Rabbi Yeshua sitting on a mita shel zav, and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva, they're sitting as well. They're in the presence of Rabbi Yosef ben Hurkins. And why they come? Because Bimei Rabbi Yosef ben Hurkins, and they felt that Rabbi Yosef ben Hurkins didn't know that Tzaras Abbas is really Aser because he was old and his eyesight was schwach, and as a result he stopped coming to Beis Medrash. So they're here to notify him and to tell him that you should know Tzaras Erba is really Aser. But they didn't want to jump right into Tzaras Erba. So they decided they're going to skirt around the issue a little bit. They started discussing this halacha. I'll tell you a nice word that I heard, something on the parasha, something on the sugya, actually deal with Tzaras Abbas, until somehow they were able to angle the conversation to, they were talking about Tzaras Abbas. So they told the place of an Orkin, tell me, Tzaras Abbas Mao, what's the halacha related to a Tzaras Abbas? I'm going to tell them, Machlokes b'Shammai b'Hillel. He said, what do you mean? Everyone knows. It's Machlokes b'Shammai b'Hillel. Hillel says Tzaras Abbas is Asa. B'Shammai, Tzaras Abbas is Mutter. So he said, halacha k'divrei mi. Who do we pass? Like, I'm going to tell them, halacha k'Beis Hillel. The halacha is like Beis Hillel. Amrulei. They said, really? You just said that? You hold halachas like Beis Hillel. I've heard in your name that halacha k'Beis Shammai. That the halacha is like Beis Shammai. Oh, he told them, tell me, when you heard in my name that the halacha is like Beis Shammai, you heard someone say Rabbi Doisa holds that the halacha is like Beis Shammai, or maybe Ben Hurkin is Shamata. Maybe you heard that the son of Hurkin has said that the halacha is like Beis Shammai. What did he mean to tell him? He told him, Chaye Rebbe, Stam. So they told him next, Stam Shamanu. We heard Ben Hurkinis. He says, I'm going to tell you, Pshat. Ach Kotan Yeshli, I have a younger brother. Bechar Satan, who? He's a Bechar Satan, which means he's a very, very wise person. The Yonason Shammai, his name is Yonason. Vahumi Talmidei Shammai. And he's from the Talmidim of Shammai, and he's the one that said that Tzaras Erev was Mutter. I never said it. I don't like Beis Hillel. It's my younger brother who hat sich zigechepet to the school of Shammai, and he's the one that said that Tzaras Erev was Mutter. But it's not me. You didn't hear me. You heard Ben Hurkinis. You thought it was me. It's my brother. He's also Ben Hurkinis, and he's the one that you heard it from. He said, but listen, if you want to talk to him and learning, that's fine. But do it at your own risk. Because I'm letting you know right now, he's a tremendous lamdin. He's a big oikaharim, like we saw in Daf Yudalad, that in general, the Talmidim of Shammai, they were on a different level than the Talmidim of Hillel. And he says, I'm telling you, he has 300 rayas that Tzaras Erva is really mutter. Stating that, so a place of Rukin said, so you're probably wondering, if my brother has 300 rayas, And he said, trust me, you're not going to win an argument with him. So why would like Basil that Tzara Zerva's mutter? L'chura, I should hope it's us. Shammai and Ba'aretz. He says, because Shammai and Ba'aretz can testify on my behalf. Shamaducha zu Yashav Chagei Hanavi. That Chagei Hanavi sat on this meducha. He literally pointed to a place where Chagei Hanavi sat for Amr. He said, Shlosh Dvar. He said three things. Number one, Tzaras Abbas Asura. But Tzaras Ervaz Asur. Number two, Aminu Moav Asur Ma'isa Ani B'Shvius. That the lands of Aminu Moav, even though they're technically part of Eretz Yisrael, but you have to be mafresh Ma'isa Ani during Shemitah. We'll see what that means later. And we can be Makabel Gerim converts from the Karduim and the Talmudim, and we're going to see what that is as well. But either way, says the Gemara, when the three Tanoim, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, and Rabbi Akiva entered the house of Rabbi Bais ben Hyrcanus, so they entered through one door, right? They were waiting outside. The Shifcha saw them. She went and she told Rabbi Bais ben Hyrcanus that the Chachmi Yisrael are here, Yikansu, the Nichnasu, they all came through one door. When they left, they left in three different doors, and there's different opinions why. One shot is because they were trying to meet Rabbi Yomi ben Hyrcanus. They wanted to meet this younger brother of Bais ben Hyrcanus. They wanted to hear the 300 chuvas. They wanted to hear what he had to say. Meaning he has all this different lumdis in terms of why Tzaras Erva is mutter, right? When we think of the lumdis of the sugi of Tzaras Erva, we think of Rabbi Kiveger's kashna. So this is Rabbi Yomi ben Hyrcanus who has 300 kashas in the sugi of Tzaras Erva. They dafka wanted to meet him, so they felt like this, they'll hedge themselves. They'll spread out. They'll diversify. You go this way, I'll go that way. You go this way. Like this, between the three of us, we're going to bump into. Says the Gemara, Paga by Rabbi Akiva. So which one of the three tzaddikim met Rabbi Yomi ben Hyrcanus? It was Rabbi Akiva, and he met him. Actually, for Ukme. So they started handling and learning. They started discussing the sugi of Tzaras Erva, and at the end of the day, Rabbi Yomi ben Hyrcanus won. Rabbi Akiva could not beat Rabbi Yomi ben Hyrcanus in the argument. Amaloi. So Rabbi Yomi ben Hyrcanus says, "Tell me, you're the famous Rabbi." It's exactly what his brother said, right? You're the famous Rabbi Akiva, whose reputation goes misoifai. So Rabbi Akiva nodded. He said, He says, "You're very fortunate that you were zoichet to have a good reputation. Now that I've had the opportunity to talk to you and learning and have a cup of coffee with you, since I must say that to me, you don't even come to a pastor. You don't even come to a shepherd. So the Akiva, he says, Aroye Bakr, I don't come to. He said, I feel a Roye Tzayin. He says, I don't even come to a Roye Tzayin. This concludes the story. We will very much return to this tomorrow in the Reid, but for now, we have a daf to learn. So the Gemara says that Rabbi Bais said, I have a younger brother, Yomi ben Hyrcanus. He's a tremendous lamb, and he has 300 rayas that Tzaras Erva is mutter like Bisham, stating that I hold like Basil, that Tzaras Erva is also. Why? He said, because I heard it in the name of Chagei Hanavi. Because Chagei Hanavi sat on Meducha Zu, and he said three things. He said, Tzaras Erva is also like Basil. He also said that Amoin Umayav Ma'asrin Meiser Oni B'Shvius, and finally he said Umikablin Gerin Min HaKarduin Umin HaTarmud. So the first Amoin Umayav Ma'asrin Meiser Oni B'Shvius. What does this mean? And why is it even a chiddush? The reason it's a chiddush is because Amun Umayav was part of Eretz Yisrael. When the Yidden entered Eretz Yisrael, in the times of Moshe Rabbeinu and Yeshua ben Nun, they conquered Amun Umayav. And as a result, Amun Umayav, even though it was Me'ever HaYarden, but it was part and parcel of Eretz Yisrael. So if it's part of Eretz Yisrael, that means Shvius is Noyeg in Amun Umayav. If Shvius is Noyeg, there's no Chi of Chumas or Maisris during Shvius. Right, the first year, second year, third year, fourth year, fifth year, sixth year, but the seventh year Shemitah, everything is Hefker. And if it's Hefker, it's Pashat, there's no Chi of Maisris. So this concept that Amun Umayav should be Chayiv and Meiser Ani and Shvius is naturally a very big chiddush. The Gemara says, what's the pshat? The Gemara says the pshat. There were many lands, many cities that the Yidden, when they were going into Eretz Yisrael for the first time, the Oilei Mitzrayim, they conquered. But the Oilei Bavel did not conquer. Okay. Any land that was conquered by the Oilei Mitzrayim, that was not conquered by the Oilei Bavel, does not have Kedusha. Because Kedusha Rishayna was bottled when Nebuchadnezzar and Nevuzrad and Sarat HaBachim destroyed the Beis HaMikdash. So if that's the case, Amun Umayav was two of those lands. It was included in the lands that were conquered by the Oilei Mitzrayim. They weren't conquered by the Oilei Bavel. And because they weren't conquered by the Oilei Bavel, so therefore, in the times of the second Beis HaMikdash, they actually did not have Kedushas Eretz Yisrael. And the reason they didn't have Kedushas Eretz Yisrael was v'hinichon, who's done b'dafka. Meaning, if the Oilei Bava wanted to conquer Amud Aleph, they could have very easily done it. It wouldn't have been a big deal. The reason they didn't do it was because they knew that the Aniyim were going to need a place to be able to get Ma'asrani on Shemitah. So listen to what they did. It's a tremendous chiddush in the world of Ma'asras. What they did was they said, Amud Aleph, we're not going to conquer. Because we're not conquering it, so it's not going to have Kedusha Shnia. It has Kedusha Rishon, Kedusha Shnia, Kitchel L'Shaitim, like Kitchel L'Asalav. As a result, there's not going to be any laws of Shvias. Now, if there's no laws of Shvias, there should also be no laws of Trumas and Ma'asras. Here's the kicker. They said, but Trumas and Ma'asras, you are going to be chayiv. What do you mean? I thought the land was never conquered. Midrabanan, you can be chayiv in Trumas and Ma'asras. But not just that, because you don't have Shvias and you do have Trumas and Ma'asras, you're going to have Trumas and Ma'asras even in the 7th year. And you'll be chayiv and Ma'asr Ani during the 7th year. Why was it done? It was done partially for the Aniyim, because otherwise the Aniyim would have issues. They'd struggle mightily during Shvias. So just to give them another source of income, they said you could go to Amud Aleph. Over there, Yidden are going to be working the fields. They're going to be chayiv and Ma'asrani. They're not going to have the laws of Shvias. It's going to end up benefiting the Aniyim. Right? Ma'asrani is 10% of your gross income. It's a lot of money. So as a result, like this, you can go to, you'll be able to collect. And that's what this was all about. Talk to Gemara. The third thing that Chagai Hanavi said was, "Umekabun gerim min akarduin umin atarmudim." So apparently these were two kihilos where non-Jews lived, where there would have been a havamina, ben benoy shel havamina, that maybe you can't be mekabel gerim from these places. Kamash Malon Chagai Hanavi said, "Mekabun gerim min akarduin umin atarmudim." Says the Gemara, that's true. Tani Rami Bar Yecheskel taught a Bais. Ein mekabel gerim min akarduim. He said before, you can't be mekabel gerim min akarduim. So here we have mekabel gerim min akarduim, and here we have ein mekabel gerim min akarduim. So the Gemara says, Rav Ashi said kartuim itma. No, mekabel gerim min akarduim. Ein mekabel gerim min akartuim. So you can't confuse karduim with a dalid and kartuim with a taf. With a dalid, mekabel gerim. With a taf is ein mekabel. The Gemara says, in fact, the Amri Inshi, there is a saying that people say, Kartuyim psulim. The people of that are members of this place, Kartuyim, are psulim, and because they're psulim, it's for that reason you can't be mekabel gerim. We'll explain in 1 second. Ikadamri, some had a different nusach, a different version of this. That Tommy, Rami Bar Yecheskel, ain't mekabel gerim and not Kartuyim. Rami Bar Yecheskel said you can't be mekabel gerim and not Kartuyim. My love, I know Kartuyim, is Kartuyim and Kartuyim the same place? I'm Rav Ashi, like Kartuyim, Kartuyim is one place, Kartuyim is another place, ain't mekabel gerim and not Kartuyim. However, mekabelin gerim menat karduim. Like people say, the people in Karduya were apostle, they weren't okay, and it's for that reason we're not mekabel gerim from this. So what's this all about? What does it mean? The people in Karduya were psulim, and as a result, we can't be mekabel gerim. And just to back up for a second, in the Torah already, there are certain nations that were not allowed to convert into Judaism. Amud Aleph, you have a Mitzri and a Doimi, right? Depending on what generation. But there is a concept of there being people that are not allowed to enter B'Kal Hashem. That's a din d'oraisa. That's psukim in the Torah. There's lavin and essen associated with all those azaras. This is something else. This is something that the Rabbanan said, that we're not going to be mekabel gerim from this particular community, from that zip code. The question is, why not? So the Gemara said because they were psulim, they were apostle. What does that mean? What it means is that even though these people seem to have been non-Jews, but at the same time, within the group of non-Jews, within that population, there were a lot of Jews, but Jews that were mamzerim. And the rest of the story is, we'll see really on the base, but just Pasha to understand, before we go weiter, it's because there were a lot of people from that Kehillah that had been boil B'nai Yisrael. And they had children from those B'nai Yisrael. Now there's a big Machlokes in Shas. Eved v'kuti haba bas Yisrael. When the father of a child is a non-Jew and the mother of the child is a Jew, what's the halacha with the child? Is the child kosher? Is the child apostle? So everybody knows the child is a yid. That's because we paskin like that. But on a Talmudic level, on a Gemara level, it's really a big shayla. And so that man that holds that avlad mamzer, the child's going to be a mamzer. The Chachamim in our Gemara were of the opinion that Eved v'kuti haba bas Yisrael havlad mamzer. These Kartuim were gefährliche Menschen, and they were ma'anis b'nai Yisrael. And through the b'nai Yisrael, they ended up fathering children. Those children ended up settling together with the Kartuim, and as a result, these children were mamzerim. So you think that someone that is a non-Jew, quote unquote, from this land, is a non-Jew. So let's just be Mekabel Gerim. From a conversion perspective, what's the big deal? The teretz is it's a huge deal because you can be Mekabel a Ger. Of course, there's a parish of Geris. The sugis of Geris, by the way, are Mesachtes Yevamos and Perak Achoylitz, Geshmak and Gemaras coming up. But in terms of a mamzer, you can't be Mekabel a mamzer. A mamzer is a apostle, and there's no Geris that can be Matayr mamzeris. And it's for that reason the Chachamim held that a Mekabel Gerim and a Kartuim. It just seems there was some confusion because it was a place that was known as the Karduim, and then there was the place where the Kartuim lived, and there was a stira, because we know Fakir, you are the Kabul from the Karduim. One says, yeah, Karduim, yeah. Kartuim is where the problem is. I'll give more on this note. Rabbi Yochanan the Savio. Rabbi Yochanan and Savio. Savio is the name of a person. They both said, that we're not Mekabel Gerim from the Tarmudim. So remember, Chagai said, Mekabel Gerim in a Karduim, and Mekabel Gerim in a Tarmudim. They had a problem. You are Mekabel from Karduim? I thought we're not Mekabel from Kartuim. I says, yeah, Karduim, yeah, Kartuim not. Okay, now up to the next shtetl. Mekabel Gerim in a Tarmudim. But Rabbi Yochanan and Savia both said, "In Mekabel Gerim in a Tarmudim." Yeah, Rabbi Yochanan, is it possible? Rabbi Yochanan said, "We're not Mekabel Gerim from Tarmudim." But Tanan, we learned in the Mishnah, and this Mishnah is a Mesechtes Nida, Kolak Samim Habam, and I reckon all Samim that come from Reckon are considered to be Tahar. For Rabbi Yehuda Matana, Rabbi Yehuda says they're Tameh, Mipnei Shehem Gerim. The reason is because the people that lived in Reckon were Gerim, that were Toyin, meaning they didn't follow the Yiddish Aveg, and it's for that reason that the Ksumim are really going to be Tameh. However, a kesem that comes from the Kechavim, so there the halacha is for sure is going to be Tameh. So what does this mean? So we're discussing Dam Nida. Now, when we talk about Dam Nida, there's Dam Nida Da'iraisa, and there's Dam Nida Da'Rabban. Dam Nida Da'iraisa is when a woman is Raya Dam Nida, but it comes al Yidei Hargosh. Right? This is Nida 101. Dam Nida D'Rabbanan is when a woman finds blood, she finds a stain, a kesem, that because she didn't have her gush at the time that the dam left her guf, so that Dam Nida is only a Dam Nida D'Rabbanan. It's not considered a Dam Nida D'Iraisa. The halach is that the Chachamim were geyser that a non-Jew should have Dam Nida. The reason it's only Xeris Chazal is because Midei Raisa, really, a non-Jew doesn't have Dam Nida. However, the Chama will go that they should have Dam Nida, but only Dam Nida Dei Raisa as opposed to Dam Nida D'Rabban. So if the Dam Nida was a Kesem, it's going to be okay. So that's what the Mishnah is saying, that a Kesem that comes from Rekem is Tar. And the reason is because we assume they're any Yehudim. If they're any Yehudim, there's no Xeris Chazal, and as a result, you have nothing to worry about. Rabbi Yehuda mit Tama. Rabbi Yehuda said they weren't any Yehudim. They were Yehudim that just behave like any Yehudim. And as a result, there is they're going to be Tomei. However, that's clear. Everyone agrees that if the Kesem came from a place where only Ovdei Kechavim lived, so any zip code where you know who lives there, it's Ovdei Kechavim Tahir. So the Gemara says, it sounds like any place that Ovdei Kechavim live, if a Kesem comes from there, the Kesem is going to be Tar. And it's going to be true, even from Talmud. Okay, Rabbi Yochanan says, you see that the people that are living in Talmud were sharing and we're non-Jews. And because they were non-Jews, that's why the Ksumim were Tahar. And a much bigger nafkamina, if someone from Talmud wants to convert, we would accept it. Meaning, what was the other side? It seems that Talmud was a controversial place. And there were people that thought that really the people living there were Jews. They just weren't behaving properly. And maybe they were psulim, and as a result, they were mamzerim, which would mean that we shouldn't be Mekabel Gerim. Rabbi Yochanan said that you see that they're Ksumim Matahirim. If they're Ksumim Matahirim, that means they're non-Jews. If they're non-Jews, that means they're also not mamzerim. If they're not mamzerim, there's no reason we shouldn't be able to be Mekabel Gerim from them. But what do you see from here? What did Rabbi Yochanan say? Zoysa Meres, quote, Mikabel Gerim Mitan. He proved it from the Mishnah. From the fact that the Mishnah says every single place where non-Jews live, the Ksumim are going to be tar, even Talmud. That's it, right. The people in Talmud are non-Jews. Good. So you see that Mikabel Gerim in Talmud. I, Rabbi Yochanan and Savia both said, hey, Mikabel Gerim in Talmudim. It's a Schwarz and Weiß stira. Rabbi Yochanan, the Savia Damit Ravayu, ein Mekabel Gerim in Talmudim. And here we have Rabbi Yochanan said, Zoysa Meres from the Mishnah, Mekabel Gerim in Talmud. So ein Mekabel Gerim in Talmud, or Mekabel Gerim in Talmud. Someone said, the Chitim is Zoysa Stira. Maybe you'll tell me that La'olam, Rabbi Yochanan holds ein Mekabel Gerim in Talmud. That's why he and Savia both paskin that way. So what did Rabbi Yochanan mean when he said Zoysa Meres Mekabel Gerim in Talmud? He wasn't saying what he believes. He wasn't expressing his own shita. He wasn't paskening. He was learning a Mishnah. And he said, you want to know what you see in this Mishnah? You see in the Mishnah, Mekabel Gerim Mitarmud. Up until they by Sphira. No one says he holds that way. Mar says it can't be that way. Because Rabbi Yochanan, we know Rabbi Yochanan has a cloud throughout Shas. Halacha is not Mishnah. That halacha is always like a Stam Mishnah. So what Rabbi Yochanan said, Zoyse Meres from the Stam Mishnah that Mekabel Gerim Mitarmud, that means Rabbi Yochanan must hold Mikabel Gerim Mitarmud, because he holds halacha mistam Mishnah, which is a steer to the fact Rabbi Yochanan and Sabi both said, Ein Mikabel Gerim Mitarmud. That's the kasha, and for the Gemara, you have no choice. You have to say Amayra and Ninu Valid Rabbi Yochanan. That really there's a Machlokes Amayram going on over here. What exactly Rabbi Yochanan's shita was? Meaning one Amayra held Rabbi Yochanan holds Ein Mikabel Gerim Mitarmudim, and there's another Amayra that held that Rabbi Yochanan holds halacha mistam Mishnah. Which means that whether or not Rabbi Yochanan holds halacha kistam Mishnah is really a machlokes amiram, which by the way the Gemara mentions in many places, that whether or not Rabbi Yochanan in fact holds halacha kistam Mishnah was something that was very debatable. Not everybody believed that. Meaning there is Rabbi Yochanan Shas that holds halacha kistam Mishnah. However, not everyone agrees that that was Rabbi Yochanan Shita. So that's the way we're going to have to answer the steer. The Gemara uses this teretz to get out of situations in different places. This is one of the places that the Gemara uses. It's up to Gemara. Mitam with my time Allah. Why is it that ein mekabling gerin minat tarmudim? So we spoke about why ein mekabling gerin minat kartuim. So now we're trying to understand why ein mekabling gerin minat tarmudim. And who said ein mekabling gerin minat tarmudim? It was Rabbi Yochanan and Savia. So the Gemara, keeping those names in mind, Rabbi Yochanan and Savia. It was a machlok pligi baruch mesavia. It was a machlok Rabbi Yochanan and Savia. Why ein mekabling gerin minat tarmudim? So Rabbi Yochanan and Sabi are the ones that said on Amud Aleph, Ein Mekabel Gerim Atamudim, and on Amud Beis they're arguing amongst themselves why Ein Mekabel Gerim Atamudim. Chadam one said Mishum Avdei Shlomo. It was related to something that the slaves of Shlomo Melech did. The Chadam and the other one said Mishum Bnei Yerushalayim. It's related to the Bnei Yerushalayim. The Gemara explains Bishlam Madam Mishum Avdei Shlomo. Bishlam Madam it says Avdei Shlomo. I understand what it must mean. Probably what it means is that the Avdei Shlomo went and they were ma'anis noshim from this area, and as a result, the Avdei Shlomo were non-Jews, the Noshim were Jews, and Kosovar Ovikichavim be'Eved, a non-Jew, Haba Bas Yisrael, Havlad Mamzer. So amongst the Talmudim, they were Mamzerim. So you could be Mekabel Geirim if they're non-Jews, but if they're Yisraelim Mamzerim that just look like non-Jews, well, then you can't be Mekabel Geirim. So that must be what Avdei Shlomo means. Meaning, Avdei Shlomo did this Avera. They fathered these children, and as a result, Mamzerim were brought, and that's what the issue is. But the manam that says it was Bnei Yerushalayim, what's the rest of the story? Pligi bar Rav Yosef Rabban. So we have a Machlokes Beis Rabban. Mishmei Rabbi Rab Chanan, and they both said their sheet in the name of Rabbi Chanan. One said, Treisa Alfei Gabri, there were 12,000 men, Veshisa Alfei Kashtuye, and 6,000 archers. 18,000 people in total. The other one said, Treisa Alfi Gabi, there were 12,000 men. Uminayo Shisa Alfi Kashtuye. Amongst them, there were 6,000 archers, meaning 12,000 in total, which, okay, what about these people? But Yidden entered the Heichel to destroy the Beis HaMikdash. Everybody was busy trying to get money. But they went after the Bnei Yerushalayim. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, Noshim B'tzion Inu B'sulois Ba'are Yehuda. They went after the Bnei Yerushalayim. They were ma'ana and ma'anes, the Bnei Yerushalayim. They had children. Those children ended up in Talmud. Those children were raised like non-Jews, but really they were Yidden. They were Yisraelim Mamzerim. Because again, our whole Gemara is of the opinion that Eved V'Kuti Abba Bas Yisrael Havlad Mamzer. And that's why Ein Mekabel Gerim Atamudim. So really, Ein Mekabel Gerim Atamudim because they were Yisraelim Mamzerim. They came about because of an Eved V'Kuti Abba Bas Yisrael Havlad Mamzer. The question just is specifically what happened. Was it the Avdei Shlomo, or was it some of the Yidden that had destroyed the Beis HaMikdash, Noshim B'tzion Inu B'sulois Ba'ari Yehuda? But either way, at the end of the day, the punchline is the same. A little more Gemara. Pasuk says Sar Ha'olam. The following pasuk was said by the Sar Ha'olam. So who is the Sar Ha'olam? Rashi says a Malach. What's the pasuk? Nar Ha'yisi Gamza Kanti V'loy Ro'isi Tzadik Neza V'zayim V'lakesh Lachet. So the Gemara says, man, I mean, he said this. Ilim Kuch B'richu. Are you going to say the Eibush said a Miyik is Zikna Kameh? But Hashem said Nar Ha'yisi Gamza Kanti. But Hashem has Zikna, and you could say Hashem is a Nar. What does that mean? Hashem's not young, Hashem's not old. So it can't be the Eibush said it. Elo David Amre. Maybe David Amelch's the one that said it. It's a pasuk in Tehillim. So if it's a pasuk in Tehillim, it makes sense. David would have said it. Oh, but Vikashish Kulei Hai. David Amelch never got that old. Right? David HaMelech passed away when he was 70. So Naro Yisi Gamzo Kanti, he was never that old. Elish Mami no Sara Olam. Must be it was the Sara Olam. Interesting Gemara. I just what's found in the pasuk that says Yodei Paras Tsar Al Kol Machmadeha. So this is also a pasuk in Eicha. Says the Gemara. So Amud Aleph, it's referring to Amud Aleph. Shoshin nichnasu Oivdei Chavan leheichel. When the Oivdei Chavan entered the heichel, hakol nifnu al kesef zab. Everybody was going for kesef zab. Besides for the 12,000 or the 18,000 people that we mentioned earlier that went to the Bais Yisrael. But the Hein Amud Aleph, they didn't go for kesef zab. They went. Hein nifnu al Sefer Torah. They were looking for a Sefer Torah. They opened up the Sefer Torah and they said, "Zesha kasav boy la yavoi amoyni umayavi bekal Hashem yisaref ba'esh." This Sefer Torah that it says that this is Amud Aleph talking, we're not worthy of intermarrying and even converting. You won't accept our conversion. Yisaref ba'esh. That's what they did. Tziva Hashem liYaakov svivav tzara. Tznak the Gemara. What does this mean? Read the words. Tziva Hashem liYaakov. HaKadosh Baruch Hu was mitzvah, that sviv of tzara, that the Yidden would always be surrounded by people that cause them tzaras. Rav said, I'll give you an example. So the Fum Nahara was a place that the Yidden lived, and they were surrounded by Humanya. Rashi says Yevonim, they were Yevonim, they were Greeks, they were Macedonians. But either way, Tziva Hashem liYaakov sviv of tzara, very scary pasuk. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu was mitzvah, literally, it's mechukei ateva. That this is the way it is. That the Jews are always surrounded by people that want to give them tzaras, Gemara, and we will stop here. So as it relates to today's daf, and really, we're shtickle bal choiv for the entire sugya of the Shammai and Hillel, so we left enough time to get into it a little bit, and that is, we just learned a sugya, a 3.5 block sugya, that discusses the Shammai and Hillel. Specifically, the topic is whether Beis Shammai, who throughout Shas argued with Beis Hillel in halacha, does that mean that they actually practice tishitasam, asu va'asu, like their own shita, or perhaps they acknowledged that halacha was like Beis Hillel, based on the fact that Beis Hillel was the Reid, and there is a concept of achirabim lahatos. Now, it's for that reason that at the end of the day, even though they saw the world so differently than Beis Hillel did, but at the same time, when it came Lamaisa, they actually followed the Shita of Beis Shammai. So it was a discussion of the Shita of Beis Hillel. So it was a discussion in the Gemara, and the Gemara came out, the very, very top line of today's daf, that Bimei Reb Doisa ben Hurkin is Utru Tzaras Habas La'achim, and if that's the case, Shmamina Asu Shmamina. You see from here that they actually followed their own Shita, and they actually did what they said they did. Now, if you think about it for a second, just meditate on this. It's a davar nifla, because you learn through Gemara, Daf Yomi. Throughout Shas, we encounter different machlokes in between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai said right, Beis Hillel said left. Beis Shammai said this, Beis Hillel said that. They so often disagreed, and they weren't just disagreeing on dvarim shel nabekach, but they were disagreeing on dvarim ha'omdim berumay shalayla. The Gemara gave a whole list of examples in the sugya about inyane ishtos, where Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel argued. Meaning, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel literally argued, is this woman married or is she not married? If she has a child right now, is the child going to be a mamzer or is the child going to be a kosher? You can see what the implications are going to be. Throughout Masechtas Shabbos, you have machlokes in between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. So, according to Beis Shammai, you're mechal Shabbos if you do this. According to Beis Hillel, it's mutter. This is something that you're allowed to do. In the world of Tumah v'Tahira, you have all the different machlokes in between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. In other words, Lefia Maskanas Agamara here in Masechtas Yevamos, that Beis Shammai was asu ka'asu, like Rabbi Yochanan Shita, like Shmuel Shita. They actually follow their own opinion. That means that if somebody would spend a Shabbos in the world of Beis Shammai, coming from Beis Hillel, he would think he just walked into another religion. It was literally a completely different world. So here you have Klal Yisrael that's divided into two camps. You're either Beis Shammai or Beis Hillel. There's no other, right? So you're either Beis Shammai or Beis Hillel. And literally, if you're Beis Shammai, you conduct yourself one way. And if you're part of Beis Hillel, you conduct yourself another way. You could understand why this was a big deal. We could appreciate why it was very, very important that on some level this be reconciled. We already mentioned the Lashon of the Mesilas Yesharim, but it's kedai to mention it again just for effect. Says the Ramchal in the end of Perek Chaf, in Perek Mishkal HaChasidus, he says, Inyan Machlokes Shammai and Beisol Haya Inyan Kavod Yisrael. The Machlokes Shammai and Beisol was an Inyan Kavod Yisrael. It was a very challenging, difficult time. Because of the great Machlokes that was raging between them. And eventually it was resolved that Allah will always be like Beisol. Hine, says the Ramchal, Kiyuma Shal Torah. In order for the Torah to exist, we have to accept Shekmar Din Zeh Yishar B'chol Toikef Lo Ad Ula Omei Olamim. For Lo Yechash B'Shum Panim. It should never be weakened. Shalei Teyas the Torah Chas V'Chalil V'Kishtei Torahs. To make sure that the Torah doesn't become two Torahs. Because until this situation was resolved, there was a chashash, there was a concern that the Torah would eventually become two Torahs. So finally it was resolved, and this was the most important thing. It's Kiyuma Shal Torah, says the Ramchal. Shekmar Din Zeh Yishar B'Chol Toikef Lo Ad Ula Omei Olamim Lo Yechash B'Shum Panim. You can understand why. Because it's literally two different words. So how was it resolved? How was the machlokes between Shammai and Beisol resolved? So we know the answer. We've spoken about this so many times. It's a Gemara. The Masechtes Erev in Daf Yud Gimel Amud Beis. The Gemara says, Amar Rab Abba, Amar Shmuel. Rab Abba said the name of Shmuel. Shalei Shonim Nachlik Beishamai and Beisol. There were 3 years that Beishamai and Beisol argued. Halal Oimrim Alach to Meiseinu. Beishamai said Allah is like us. Halal Oimrim Alach to Meiseinu. Beisol said Allah is like us. Yatz so Baskal Amra. Finally, a Baskal came out and said, Elu ve'elu divrei kim chayim hein. Everybody's right. But v'alacha ki Beisil. The halacha is like says the Gemara. If it's elu ve'elu divrei kim chayim, why was Beisil zoicha that halacha is k'moisam? And the Gemara said it had less to do with their intellectual abilities. It had more to do with their midas. It had more to do with their ben adam l'chaveroi. So how is this dispute resolved? It's a Gemara Masechtes Eruvin, Daf Yud Gimel Amud Beis. So here's the question, and this is going to be the topic of the Reid. And that is, when did this Baskol take place? When was it that the Chachamim was sitting around and all of a sudden they look at each other? Do you hear something? Right, there's a Baskol. There's a heavenly voice that says, Elu ve'elu divrei elikim chayimein v'halacha ki Beisil. When exactly, historically, did it take place? So this is something that the Olam discussed over the years many times, but I found a mitzvah. I found a maramakim nifla. It's in a sefer called Yesod HaMishnah V'Arichasa, and the mechaber of the sefer is Hagoyen, the great Sinai, Rab Ruven Margolis. So Rab Ruven Margolis, in a sefer Yesod HaMishnah V'Arichasa, he asks this question. He wonders out loud, when was it that this Baskol took place? And Kedarke Bakodesh, he brings raya after raya after raya to what he believes, his theory, of when exactly this Baskol happened. And he says, once you understand this, it's going to open up a lot of Gemaras, a lot of Chidoy Stumos that we find throughout Shas. Of course, like with every piece of Reuven Margolis, we'll just speak out a few highlights, because it's impossible to go through all the different rayas that he says. So the emes is, this Gemara, Masechtes Eruvin, Daf Yud Gimel Amud Beis, that says that the Baskol was, that the Machlokes B'Shammai Beisol was resolved with a Baskol, is mentioned in Yerushalmi also. It's mentioned twice. Once in Masechtes Brachos, twice in Masechtes Yevamos. Right here, the end of the first parak of Masechtes Yevamos, the Yerushalmi says, what the Gemara says in Erev and Yud Gimel, that the way the Machlokes B'Shammai Beisol was resolved was with a Baskol. But the Yerushalmi adds one word, a very important clue. The Yerushalmi says that the Baskol happened when the Yidden were in Yavna. That the Yidden were in Yavna, and when the Yidden were in Yavna, they heard the Baskol. So what was the significance of Yavna? So everyone knows that when the Beis HaMikdash was in the process of being destroyed, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was the leader of the Jewish people at the time, he was the Nasi, this is Bayesheni, so he was smuggled out of Eretz Yisrael. He had a nephew that had an inn, and he was able to get him through customs, and he had an audience with the Caesar of Rome. So imagine, he's literally in Rome during a war at the time that the Beis HaMikdash is on the verge, on the brink of being destroyed, and he has the opportunity to sit in front of the Caesar of Rome. He impresses, the Gemara says, the Caesar of Rome tremendously, to the point that the Caesar of Rome says, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, I'm so misfall from you, I'll tell you what, ask 3 things, and I'll give it to you. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai thought, and he said, these are the 3 things that I want. The first thing he said was, Tein li yavna v'chachamel. The second thing he said was that I want you to make sure you spare the family of Hillel Azalk and the family of Rabbi Gamliel. And the third thing was, he said there's a Yid Reb Tzaddik who's been fasting, that the Bais Hamikdash shouldn't be destroyed. He's very not well. I need you to send a doctor from Rome, one of your best physicians, so he should come and he should heal Reb Tzaddik. But Rabbi Yochanan Zak, I said, Tein li yavna v'chachamel. What did he mean? He meant that the Yidden, the Chachamim at that time were in Yavna. And he said, I want you to make sure that Yavna, which had a yeshiva at the time, is going to be saved. And we've spoken about this. The Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai was mevater on the Beis Hamikdash. Abisol Zayin Torah. He should have Yavna v'chachamel. But the point is, Yavna was the place that the Tanaim that lived at the time of the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash. That's where they lived at the time. That's where the yeshiva was. And says the Yerushalmi, it's often a Yerushalmi, in two places, that this Baskel took place where? It took place where the Yidden were in Yavna. So we have a tremendous clue that narrows it down. So we have a general idea of where it happened. We know where it happened, but we still haven't pinpointed exactly where it happened. Zalka Ruvim Agolis, that Yesh Loimar, it happened at the same time that one of the most famous Gemaras in Shas happened. That is Masechtes Brachas, Daf Chav Zayin Amud Beis, Masechtes Brachas Daf Chav Ches. So the Gemara is too long for us to go through it inside. But the Gemara says that there was a dispute amongst the Tanan regarding davening Ma'ariv, Tfilas Arvis. Is Tfilas Arvis Rishus or is Tfilas Arvis Chayfa? And the Gemara says it was a story with a Talmud Echad that appeared in front of Rabbi Yeshua. And he asked Rabbi Yeshua, tell me, Tfilas Arvis Rishus or Chayfa? So he told him Tfilas Arvis is Rishus. Then he went to Rabbi Gamliel. This is Rabbi Gamliel, then Yavna. This is Rabbi Gamliel, who was the Nasi. And he turns to Rabbi Gamliel and he tells him, tell me, Tfilas Arvis is Rishus or Tfilas Arvis Chayfa? Amalei, he told him, Chayfa. So he said, Chayva, I heard from Rabbi Yeshua Rishus. Rabbi Gamliel said, really? Rabbi Yeshua says Rishus? He knows I hold Chayva. Why would he say Rishus? So he says, why don't you wait until Rabbi Yeshua and all the Talmidei Chachamim enter the Beis Medrash, and I'm going to bring it up, and let's see what happens. So the Gemara says, Nichnesu Bali Treisen, everybody enter, and Rabbi Yeshua was there as well. And Rabbi Gamliel tells the Talmud, stand up, and I want you to ask me the question again. So he says, Tfilas Arbis Rishus or Chayva? Rabbi Gamliel says Chayva. And Rabbi Gamliel turns to the audience and he says, if there's any person here who thinks that Tfilas Arbis is Rishus, now would be a good time to say it. And nobody said anything. So Rabbi Gamliel looks at Rabbi Yeshua, he says, Rabbi Yeshua, how about you? What do you hold? You hold Tfilas Arbis is Rishus, but Tfilas Arbis is Chayva. Rabbi Yeshua was embarrassed. And through this whole situation emerged that it's true. Rabbi Yeshua had paskin what he believed, not like Rabbi Gamliel believed, and that is that Tfilas Arbis is really Rishus. The Gemara says that Rabbi Yeshua was so embarrassed that it bothered all the Talmidei Chachamim that were there, and they decided that something has to be done to Rabbi Gamliel. And the reason was because this wasn't the first time it happened. The Gemara said it happened once before, and it happened once before that as well. Ad kidei kach nimnu v'gamru. The Rabbi Gamliel is no longer fit to be Nasi. Now, if Rabbi Gamliel is not going to be Nasi, someone else has to be the Nasi. The question is, who should it be? Now, the most worthy candidate was Rabbi Yeshua. The problem was they felt that this is a little too close because Rabbi Yeshua was the one that caused this all to happen. So it's not fair to Rabbi Gamliel to make Rabbi Yeshua the Nasi. So they said, maybe Rabbi Akiva should be. The problem with Rabbi Akiva was he didn't have yichus. They decided that it's going to be Rabbi Elazar ben Azari. He's the one that should do it. Why didn't they pick Rabbi Eliezer? So we spoke about this because he was Talmidei Beis Shammai, he was Shamuti. Why did they pick Rav Tarfon? We spoke about that once as well. We have Reid on all of this. But the bottom line is, who did they end up taking? It was Rabbi Elazar ben Azari. The problem was Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, he had a lot going for him. He was Torah of the Gedula, of the Yichus, the Makom Echad. The problem with Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was he was too young. He was only 18 years old. Ma'asa Kadosh Baruch Hu. There was a miracle. He woke up in the morning. He had a long white beard, and that's why he said, "Ireni kiven shivim shana." Really, he was only 18 years old, but he looked like he was 7. So Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah became the new Nasi. Says the Gemara. That day, that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah became the Nasi, so called the Shomer HaPesach. They removed the Shomer HaPesach. There was a person, he used to guard the Beis Medrash, and they removed the guard of the Beis Medrash. And they allowed all the Talmidim, anyone that wanted to enter Beis Medrash, they said, "You're invited in. Anyone can come here. Everyone's invited." What was the chiddush? Because Rabbi Gamliel's shita was called Talmud shein toichay kabari lo yikanis the Beis Medrash. That any Talmud that's not toichay kabari is not allowed to enter the Beis Medrash. They changed the policy, and as a result, they said anyone that wants to come could come. So the Gemara says, "Ahu Yomi on that day, there were many benches that were added to Beis Medrash. How many? One said 400. The other man said 700. The Gemara says, "Gamliel had chalish sadas. He had a dream. A ganze ma'isa." The Gemara continues. The Gemara says, "Tana Idius by the Nishnis." On that day, Masechtes Idius was taught. Okay, what's the significance of this? The Gemara continues and says that every single time you find in Shas that there's a certain day being mentioned, and the way the day is being mentioned as boy bayayim hahu yoyim, it means that day. The Gemara continues. There wasn't one halacha that there was a shaila of what the psak is that wasn't resolved on that day. And the Gemara continues and goes on and on and on. We have a Maisa that we know took place in Yavna. The Gemara says this Maisa was a story that had incredible significance. How much significance? Just reading between the lines of the Gemara, you know, tremendous. Says Rabbi Margolis that one of the things the Gemara says happened on that day was that there was no halacha, there was no machlokes that wasn't resolved on that day. He says, what does that mean? What happened to all the machlokes in between Shammai and Bais? What happened to Bais Shno, the B'yantiv? Bais Shammai says this, Bais Hillel says that. What happened to Tzara said? What happened to all the machlokes and throughout Shas between Shammai and Bais Hillel? There was no halacha, shaloi peshua. Bais Shammai and Bais Hillel were fighting on everything. The Torah was mamish two Torahs. What do you mean there was no halacha? He says, you know what the pshat is? It's posh to me. Because the Yerushalmi says in Brachas and in Yevamos that where was the Pascal that came and resolved halacha to Bais Hillel? It happened in Yavne. It must have happened on that day. And Faket, that's the teeth kind of the Gemara. That is good for what the Gemara means. That there wasn't one halacha shaloi peshua. You know why? Because you know what happened on that day? What happened on that day? The Pascal came out. That adds a tremendous layer of significance to that day. And that was when the Machlokes Shammai Bais Hillel was resolved. And that's exactly what the Gemara means. When it says, says Rabbi Margolis, when you understand this, you can appreciate Masechtas Idios a little bit better. You know, you open up Masechtas Idios. How does the Masechta begin? Idios literally begins with the word Shammai. Right? Shammai Yomi. It starts with the Machlokes with Shammai and Hill. And then it goes from there to the Machlokes in between Bais Shammai and that hill. And Idios is very much machlokes in between Bais Shammai and Bais Hillel. As a matter of fact, in the first parak of Masechtas Idios, the Mishnayos discuss different times that Bais Shammai was mekel and Bais Hillel was machmer. Right? We know ordinarily Bais Hillel was mekel and Bais Shammai was machmer. But in Masechtas Idios, you have all the mikule Bais Hillel and the mikule Bais Shammai and the mechumer Bais Hillel. He says, why is this Masechtas Idios? What is that to Masechtas Idios? Because what was Idios towards up the Gemara? It was Bais Hayai. It was on that day. What happened on that day? There was no halacha that was clear Bais Medrash Shaloi Preshua. But what was the most significant halachas that needed to be explained? The Machlokes of Shammai Bais Hillel. Because this was halacha loimer halacha k'meiseinu halacha loimer halacha k'meiseinu. So we're trying to figure out what's going on. So this needs to be settled, and it was settled on that day. So that day was gepaskin halacha Bais Hillel. So you know what happened? Idios happened. This Bais Hillel, that Bais Hillel, that Bais Hillel, this Bais Hillel. Right? You have all the different halachas related to Bais Hillel. By the way, Sarah Sarah and Idios. It's all the Masechtas Idios. And now we have to know whether it's a mikule Bais Shammai and michumer Bais Hillel, because usually Bais Shammai is the machmer, Bais Hillel is the mekel. But now that we resolved the halacha, we have to know that, by the way, don't think this is all part of Idios. This is all part of the testimony that's been given on that day. That there were times that Bais Hillel was machmer, Bais Shammai was mekel. And it's important to know it's anomalies, it's a chidushim, but at the same time, sometimes this is the way it is, and we need to know it because it's very important for us to understand that the halacha is now going to be like Bais Hillel. He says another davar nifla. The Gemara says that up until that day, where Rabbi Gamliel was the Nasi, there was a Shomer HaPesach, and he would allow certain people to enter, and he wouldn't allow other people to enter. When Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah became the Nasi, they removed the Shomer HaPesach, and they said anybody that wants to come, even if you're not Toichel Kabari, anyone that's interested in coming to learn, you're all invited to learn. That happened on that day. Why did it happen? So Pasha you learn. Because Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, he had a different hashkafa when it came to admissions in the yeshiva. Rabbi Gamliel had his quote-unquote Shomer HaPesach, and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah didn't have a Shomer HaPesach. In Rabbi Gamliel's yeshiva, you had to be Toichel Kabara. In Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, it was more inclusive, but that's Pasha the way you learn. But the emes is up Rabbi Margolis Yesh Loimar a lot starker, and that is there's an obvious to Rav Nosson at the end of Perik Bais. It's Perik Bais test. The Hemidu Talmidim Harbe. Bais Shammai says, Al Yeshana Adam Elo Lemisha Hu Chacham VeOnav Uben Avos VeAsha. A person only allowed to teach Torah to someone that's a Chacham, that's an Onav. He's a Ben Avos, he has Yichos, and he's a Gvir. No, you should teach Torah to everybody. There were many Poishim in Klal Yisrael that eventually became, they were niskarv to Torah, tzadikim, chasidim, uksherim. And had the Olam followed Beis Shammai and not taught them Torah, we would have lost that on those tzadikim, those chasidim, and those ksherim. So Beis Shammai was very particular about who you can teach Torah to. You can't teach Torah only to a person that's a chacham, he's an anav, he's a ben avis, and he's an asher. Beis Hillel was more inclusive. Beis Hillel allowed to teach Torah to everybody. Parenthetically, Rabbi Margolis says that with this is in the footnote. The footnotes are the most geschmack. This is in a footnote. He says, with this you can understand, he's Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi is in Mesachtes Psachim, it's in Perek Vav, it's Halacha Gimel. Sholosh Esrei Shana, Asa Rabbi Akiva, Nichnas Eitzel Rabbi Eliezer, this is written like a Yerushalmi, for 13 years, Rabbi Akiva went to Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Eliezer refused to teach Torah to Rabbi Akiva. It's a medrash player. We know Rabbi Akiva is a Talmud Muvik of Rabbi Eliezer. Talmud Muvik, Shebe Muvik of Rabbi Eliezer. But for 13 years, Rabbi Eliezer refused to teach Torah to Rabbi Akiva. Why wouldn't he teach Torah to him? So Rabbi Margolis, Nifla. He says because Rabbi Eliezer was Shamuti. We know that he was Talmidei Beis Shammai. He held like Beis Shammai in Ovis Rav Nosson. Ayishana Adam Elolami Shu Chacham Va'anav Uben Avos Va'asher. He said Rabbi Akiva tripped up on two of these points. Number one, he wasn't a Ben Avos, he wasn't a Meyuchis. That's the Gemara Brachas. That's why he wasn't considered to be a Nasi, and he also wasn't an Usher. Right? We know he was very, very poor. Now, Shver was a great Usher, but he was not that enough from him. So number one, he's not a Ben Avos, and number two, he wasn't an Usher. A Chacham and a Anav, yeah. Oh, but Ben Avos had an Usher. So this is Rabbi Eliezer who's following his Shita, the Shita Beis Shammai, they can't teach Torah to somebody like him. So for 13 years, he wouldn't teach him Torah. Now, what happened after 13 years? But for 13 years, maybe he became an Osher, and he became a Meyuchas. But for 13 years, he didn't teach him Torah, and he didn't teach him Torah. He says, Dosan the Pshat. But what do you see from here? That Beis Shammai had a Shita, that what do? That when it comes to teaching Torah, you can't just teach to anybody. You have to be a Chacham, and Anav, Ben Avis, and Asher. You have to be Toichei Kabaroi. Beis Hillel said, no, you teach everybody, teach Torah to everybody, because there are many Poishim that were taught Torah. They were in the sky of Yotzim, Tzadikim, Chasidim, Uksherim. You know what happened in Brachas Chav Ches Amud Aleph? The Baskol happened. The Baskol that Yerushalmi says happened in Yavna. The Baskol that said, you see, up until the Baskol, Rabbi Gamliel had the right to pick and choose who he wanted to Baskin like. He held like Beis Shammai, which, by the way, not for now, but there's many sources where you find Rabbi Gamliel and Mishpachta, he held like Beis Shammai. So he held like Beis Shammai, and because he held like Beis Shammai, so therefore he had a shita. There was a Shaymer Pesach. You have to think about it. Oh, but it's this given a Baskol. Now that there's a Baskol, you can't hold like Beis Shammai anymore. It's over. It's done. At this point, it was resolved. Even Beis Shammai, that was Asu Ba'asu. It's over now that there's a Baskol. Oh, that's what saved Klal. Oh, now there's a Baskol. Now there's a Baskol. So now they removed the Shaymer Pesach. It's not a din in Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah versus Rabbi Gamliel. It's a din in Beis Hillel versus Beis Shammai. Because this is the day that it was Gepaskin that the halachas like Beis Hillel. And because this is the day that it was Gepaskin that the halachas like Beis Hillel, so for that reason, it was on this day they removed the Shaymer Pesach. Rabbi Margolis continues. He says there's another Chida Stuma that you can understand once we are able to internalize this. That the Baskol happened in Yavna, not just on any day in Yah, happened on Brochas Chav Ches. That's when it happened. It happened, Ba'oisei Hayoy. That was the day it happened. The day Rabbi Gamliel was removed from his Asiyas, the day Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah became the Nasi. And that is, there's a Gemara in Be'er. It's a Mishnah in Be'er. The Mishnah says, Afu, referring to Rabbi Gamliel, Amar Shloish Dvarim Lahakam. He said 3 kulos. He said, Mechadin Beis Hamitos, you're allowed to sweep the room that people eat on Yantif, it's Pesachtes Be'er, we're dealing with Hilchas Yantif, Umanichem Asam Mugmar, you're allowed to take spices like levina and put it on top of coals, burning coals on Yantif. And by the Leil Seder, you're allowed to eat a gedim makus. You're allowed to eat a gedi, even though it's makus. It looks a little like the Karban Pesach. There's no chash that it looks like maybe you're bringing kachim machutz. So the Gemara says like this: is that true? Meisaveh ein mechadin beis hamitos beyantiv. You're not allowed to sweep beis hamitos on yantiv. V'shal beis Rabbi Gamliel mechadin. But in Rabbi Gamliel's house, they used to sweep on yantiv. Amar Rabbi Elazar bar Tzaddik. Rabbi Elazar bar Tzaddik said, "Pamim harbi nechnasti achter abel beis Rabbi Gamliel." There were many times that I entered I entered the house of Rabbi Gamliel together with my father, and they weren't mechaber Beis Hamidas b'yantiv. Elu mechaber noisem erev yantiv. They used to do it erev yantiv. So the Gemara says that Rabbi Gamliel's family were mechabdim, but Rabbi Elazar Tzaddik says it's not true. It's not true. I saw it with my own eyes. I went with my father many times. I remember visiting Rabbi Gamliel. They weren't mechabed. Another brayso. Rabbi Gamliel's mishpacha, they were manichin. Elazar Tzaddik says it's not true. They didn't do it. So Reuben said, which one was it? It happened, or the Gemara doesn't say. The Gemara just says Rabbi Gamliel did it. Rabbi Elazar Tzaddik said, I saw with my own eyes. I was there with my father. I was a little boy. I remember they didn't do it. Rabbi Gamliel did it. Another case. No, I saw with my own eyes. So you know what the pshat is? Because really, this shayla, whether mechabdim beis hamidas or ein mechabdim, umanichen es amugmer, ein manichen es amugmer, is the machlokes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai says no. Beis Hillel says yeah. You know what happened when Rabbi Elazar Tzaddik was a little boy and he went to Rabbi Gamliel's house together with his father? It was before the Baskol. Rabbi Reuven Margolis proves, based on history, that would have happened before the Baskol. So he said that was before the Baskol. Before the Baskol, the Gamliel was able to pick and choose. You want to go like Beis Shammai, go like Beis Shammai. You want to go like Beis Hillel, go like Beis Hillel. And it can help to be Beis Shammai, and that's why like Beis Shammai. Oh, but the Gemara brings up Bais that says that Shabbos Rabbi Gamliel mechabdin, or Shabbos Rabbi Gamliel manichin mugmer b'yantiv. That was la'achar Baskol, and if that was la'achar Baskol, he says that would explain. Once there was a Baskol, now you had no choice. You had to be Mako. You had to go like Beis Hillel. You can't go Kineged Beis Hillel once it's a Baskol. So once it's a Baskol, you can't go Kineged Beis Hillel. It's at that point they had no choice. And he says, when you understand this, there's a lot of places in Shas where you find steerers. Some saw this way, some saw that way. The teretz is, with this first generation of Tanan, after Bayesheni, they lived in two worlds. They lived in a world of Koydem HaBaskol, and they lived in a world of La'achar HaBaskol. And Koydem HaBaskol, there were two shittas, there were two opinions. There was Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. And you want to go like Beis Shammai, you can go like Beis Shammai. That's all Koydem HaBaskol, like the Gemara says in the first parak of Erevin. Oh, but La'achar HaBaskol, now you have no choice anymore. Now you have to go with the Baskol. Nimnu v'gomru. That's it. It's all over. And that's why you find stories where there were steers, but the emphasis is no steer. We'll mention one more raya, one more thought that Reuven Margolis says. That's the Gemara that we learned today. It's today's daf. The Gemara says that there was a yid, his name was Rab Doisa ben Hyrcanus. And while he was alive, he tiru tzaras habas la'ach. And the Chachamim thought that it was him. It turned out it wasn't. It was his younger brother, Yomi. But they thought he was the one that was matet tzaras habas la'ach. Listen to this Gemara. This was the very beginning of today's daf, which, if we learn a little slower, is really a chida stuma. But once we understand this, it mamish opens up. Pimei Reb Doisa ben Hyrcanus etiru tzaras habas la'ach. Vaya dava kashel lechacham, the bal of the chacham, the pnei shechacham gadol hay, because it was a big chacham. But the ein of kamu milavi lebeis medrash. But what happened was he was old and he couldn't see well, and as a result, he didn't come to Beis Medrash. What does that have to do with anything? He was old. He didn't come to Beis Medrash. And as a result, so Pasha, what it means is, he didn't come to Beis Medrash, so therefore they had to go to him, right? That's probably Pasha Pshat. But the end of coming below the Beis Medrash, so as a result, they felt that they had to go tell him something. What were they going to tell him? He helped Tzaras Habas his mutter. What are you going to tell him? Beis Hillel? He knows Beis Hillel. He's old. What's going on here? It sounds like he couldn't come to Beis Medrash. As a result, he's missing out on a piece of information. So let's go tell. What were you going to tell him? You're going to tell him Tzaras Habas is also, but they thought he didn't know that? Machlokes Beis Hillel is one of the biggest machlokes in ever. So he knows that. What exactly were they going to tell him? He says, you know what happened? What happened was there were always two shittas. There was Tzaras Erebes mutter, Tzaras Erebes also. He was matter, Tzaras Erebes. Okay, shittas based Shammai. In fact, this is the raya that also that they used to go like Beis Shammai. But then there was one day that in Beis Medrash, all of a sudden there was a Baskol. And the Baskol came out and the Baskol said, which means it's all over. You don't have the option anymore to go like Beis Shammai. Now you're mukhrich. Now you're mushbava'imit from the Baskol. Now you have to go like Beis Hillel. The problem was Reb Doisa ben Hyrcanus, who's one of the greatest matirim of Tzaras Erva. He had not been a Beis Medrash. You know why? Because it was ein of kamum love of the Beis Medrash. It was very difficult for him to come. So they said, let's go to him, let's tell him. he doesn't know. What were they telling him? They're telling him, no, they're going to handle the sugi. He learned Yevamos already a bunch of times. They know all the Reid. The problem is, he doesn't know there's a Baskel. Because he wasn't Bais Medrash. How was he supposed to know there was a Baskel? So they decided, let's go and let's notify him. And so Rabbi Reuben goes, if you're not sure this is the pshat, we learned in yesterday's daf. Hezvav Amud Beis. The Gemara said, Shalus Rabbi Yeshua. They asked Rabbi Yeshua, Tzaras Abbas Mahu. What's the halacha Tzaras Abbas? He said, okay, Balacha Yidibay me. He said, "Bnei Mata Machnisim Roishi Ben Shnei Harim Gedoylen Ben Shnei Machlokes Gedoyles Ben Beis Shammai Ben Beis Hillel." I'm not getting involved in this Machlokes. The next Gemara, this is the last Gemara of Tezvav Daf Yomi. The first Gemara in Tezayin, Rabbi Yeshua heard the Yid Rabbi Doisim Ben Horkinis, and he's mad. He said, "What? I'm going. Come." And he takes the Bas Ben Azar, he takes Rabbi Akiva. Let's go tell him. In yesterday's daf, he didn't want to opine. He said, well, what are you mixing me in? Right? A politician's answer. He said, I'm not getting the votes. And now all of a sudden, he's mamish leading the way. He's knocking on Rabbi Doisim and Horkinis' door. They're mamish, they're trying to circle and literally make sure that Rabbi Doisim and Horkinis can't get out so they can let him know that Tzaras Erev is Aser. Yesterday, he didn't want to paskin. Now, all of a sudden, today, he's going to Rabbi Doisim and Horkinis. The teretz says, well, yesterday was Kodim Abaskal. Now it's La'achar Abaskal. And that's exactly what he was coming to tell him. If I care, Rabbi Yeshua was coming to say, I'll be honest with you, I didn't want to get involved in this Shiloh. Ben Shnei Harim Gedolim. But I'm telling you, Nimnu V'Gomer, there was about, now we've spoken in the past about Rabbi Yeshua, who holds Ein Mashkichim Abaskal. But the bottom line is that's Rabbi Yeshua's coming all of a sudden now, and he's saying it. And he says, by the way, if you really want effect, really have an exclamation mark, this Mishnah, regarding Tzaras Erev is a Mishnah in the 4th parak of Masechtas Idiyos. So you see clear, mefurish, that this Machlokes was resolved on that day. It's called, it's often a Mishnah, because Idiyos was Oisei Ayoim Nishnu, and you see it's mefurish over this. That's clearly when this all happened. But the bottom line is, it opens up so many different Gemaras where we can appreciate, we can put a timeline, we can literally put a name to the face in terms of when exactly this happened. When did the Baskel happen? It happened in Yavna. That's an often in Yerushalayim. We're in Yavna, Ishloim Brachas Chavches, and it opens up Brachas Chavches. It explains what it means that there was no halacha that was tluyish in this parasha. It explains why they removed the Shomer HaPesach. It explains the Gemara's in Bais, the Gemara here in Yevamos Tezayin, and Afazoi Vait that Reuven Margolis, in one of his footnotes says, when he's talking about this thing, this whole Indian, he says that it's not rachok to say that the Gemara says in Eruvin Daf Yud Gimel Amud Beis that there were 3 years that the Talmidei Shammai still argued until the Baskel came out. So he says it's very, very yitachim that those 3 years were the 3 years that the Yidden were in Yavna. How long were the Yidden in Yavna? So Rabbi Magol says Lin Nira that it was 3 years, and those were the 3 years. And the 3 years happened then, and this sort of was the culmination of 3 years of raging back and forth between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. But either way, that's the rest of the story. But just as a postscript to this Reid, and that is, what emerges is a whole new appreciation for the Baskel, and a whole new appreciation for the Gemara and Brachas, Daf Chavches, where you see Klal Yisrael was in a Sakana Gedoyla, the Lashon of the Mesilas Yesharim, that the Machlokes B'Shammai and Beis Hillel was an Inyan Kaved Yisrael. It was a very, very, very difficult time. And then it was resolved with the Baskel that the Gemara talks about in Eruvin Yud Gimel, which we've now took place in Masechtas Brachas, Daf Chavches Amud Aleph. So just one postscript, and that is, so Danach in Gemara. There's a Gemara in Masechtas Shabbos. The Gemara is on Daf Kufla with Ches Amud Beis. The Gemara says, when the Yidden entered the Kerem in Yavna, they said, I see the Torah Shetishtachich Yisrael. There's going to be a day that Torah is going to be forgotten from Klal Yisrael. Shenemar, it's a pasuk. It says, Hine Yomim Bon Me'um Hashem Elokim V'hishlachti Rav Ba'aretz Le'Rav L'Lechem V'Leitzam L'Mayim Kiyam L'Shmoyes Divrei Hashem. There's going to be a day where there's going to be a hunger, but it's not going to be a hunger for bread. It's not going to be a thirst for water, but the hunger and the thirst is going to be Kiyam L'Shmoyes Divrei Hashem. And Chazal understood from this pasuk, understood from this nevuah of Amos, that what this means is there's going to be a day where there'll be no Torah, where it's literally going to be Yomim Bam Me'um Hashem. It's going to be a time where Torah is going to be forgotten. What triggered this? Happened in Yavna. Why in Yavna? So Pasha, you learn that the reason it happened in Yavna is because Yavna was right after the Churban. and the Beis Hamikdash was just destroyed, and it was so difficult for the Yidden. Al derech malka v'sareah b'agoyim in Torah, and as a result, there was a hergish that asli the Torah shet nishtakach miYisrael. But I think we have a little bit of a neifach. We understand it on a little bit of a deeper level. Because even in the Beis Medrash alone, what was happening is the Torah was being divided into two Torahs. And like the Ramchal says again, it was an Inyan Kaved Yisrael. This was a very, very challenging time. Because what was that risk? That chas v'chalila, the Torah would become two Torahs. And if the Torah would become two Torahs, this is Torah shet nishtakach miYisrael on the highest level. And this is something that they were so worried about. We're in Yavna, because this is where it happened. This was all taking place in Yavna. And it gives us a little bit of a deeper appreciation why this was a heritage. Yidden are walking around Yavna with mamish heavy hearts, in Kavod Yisrael, pun intended, because they understand that everything going on, both politically, in terms of what's happening in the world, and even was Tutzich and Beis Medrash, the Torah is becoming two Torahs. And what's going to be? How's Torah going to survive? That's interesting. The Gemara says at the very, very end, Tanya, Reb Shimon ben Yochai said, Chas v'sholem shetishtakach Torah miYisrael. He heard this whole brayse said, Chas v'sholem. You think Torah is going to be forgotten? There's no way Torah is going to be forgotten. Shenemar, because the pasuk says, Ki lo yishachach mipizara. Reb Shimon ben Yochai said, Torah will never be forgotten. Ki lo yishachach mipizara. I don't know when Reb Shimon ben Yochai said this, but I know what happened later in his life. You know, I know what happened later in his life because we have a Messiah. That wherever it says Reb Shimon bar Yochai, as opposed to Stam Reb Shimon, it means it's after the 13 years that Reb Shimon was in the Ma'ara. That means this Gemara happened later in life. Later, an older Reb Shimon, a Reb Shimon that's the Gadol Adar, a Reb Shimon that at that point had been Megala, all the Seidas of Kabbalah. That's the Reb Shimon that said that I know there was a Messiah. I know as in Yad Meflek Mitzog, and I see the Torah shet nishtakach miYisrael. Chas v'sholem shet nishtakach Torah miYisrael. Shenemar ki lo yishachach mipizara. It's never going to be forgotten. This was something that Reb Shimon bar Yochai said that he was older. But I don't think it's a coincidence that if you go back to that Gemara Masechtas Brachos Daf Chav Ches, the Gemara that began with the Talmud that asked Rabbi Yeshua a Shaila. The Shaila was Tfilas Arvis, Rishus or Chayva. And Rabbi Yeshua said Rishus, and then asked Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Gamliel said Chayva. And then one thing led to another until eventually Rabbi Gamliel was removed from his Nesios, until eventually Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah became the Nasi, until eventually there was a Baskel that said, Elu be'elu divelikim chayimei, or Rabbi Aloch kibeitz Mills, that the end of the whole Gemara. What does this tell me? You know, one question I've been waiting to ask the entire sugya. After all this drama, who was that Talmud? Who is the Talmud that set all these events into motion? Who is the one that asked the question? Tfilas Arvis Rishus L'Chayva. It's an interesting question, but the Gemara asks the question. It's not a fun fact. It's wichtig. And the Gemara answers the question. You know who it was? It was Reb Shimon bar Yochai. Reb Shimon bar Yochai, who years later would understand in his heart that it's not possible that Torah could be forgotten. Chas v'sholem shet nishtakach Torah miYisrael. A young Reb Shimon bar Yochai. Reb Shimon bar Yochai is not even mentioned as Reb Shimon at the time. He's just a Talmud at that point. But Reb Shimon bar Yochai himself was the one that asked the question. And through that question, until today's Reid, he's the one that caused Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah to become the Nasi, which we know is significant, but we had to be there because it's just hard to appreciate what the significance was. Now we have a little bit of an oimik of what the significance was. It saved Klal Yisrael. It saved the Torah. This matzav of sakana that was happening at that time, that the Ramchal talks about in Perek, you have to see the Ramchal inside to fully grasp the depth. That's why we keep on going back to it, of what was going on. It was saved by this Baskel. And this Baskel came about because a Talmud asked the question. And who was the Talmud that asked the question? The Talmud was Reb Shimon bar Yochai. You know, the Svar Makdoshim say that ki lo yishachach mipi zaroi, those words, ki lo yishachach mipi zaroi, is soifei tevis Yochai. It's because Reb Shimon bar Yochai is the one that said it. He's the one that said chas v'sholem shet nishtakach Torah miYisrael. Shenemar ki lo yishachach mipi zaroi. And it's merumiz in his name. Reb Shimon bar Yochai, if Yochai is soifei tevis ki lo yishachach mipi zaroi. But the emes is Reb Shimon bar Yochai's legacy in ki lo yishachach mipi zaroi is not just his memra in Shabbos Kuf Lamed Ches Amud Beis, but it was a question, an innocent question that he asked as a Talmud in Masechtas Brachos Daf Chav Zayin Amud Beis, which takes us into Masechtas Brachos Daf Chav Ches. It was a question that would assure ki lo yishachach mipi zaroi. It was a question that was asked at a time where the Yidden held I see the Torah Shetishtachich Yisrael, but there was a Rav, but not like Mayim, not Lo Lechem. It was L'Shmayas Divrei Hashem. It was scary, scary, scary times. But at the same time, it was saved. And who is it saved through? It was saved through the Heilige Tana of Shimon Bar Yochai.